it's really great that we can gather together and to do our third class in the series of the restoration of all things. And this class is called Saving Judah First, Part 2. And just again, that bit of revision, remembering that when we see in latter-day Bible prophecy, when we see the phrase Judah and Israel in the same context, well, if we see them in the same context, then you can safely say that when we see Judah, it's referring to the Jews in the land at the time of Christ's coming. Whereas if you see the phrase Israel, or the name Israel, that's referring to the Jews who are still scattered around the world, I guess, at the time of Christ's coming and the time of Armageddon. So you may remember our last class. It was quite emotional, and it brought us to the story how in the near future, Judah, or what we know today as the land of Israel, Judah will be at the brink of destruction. They will say, our bones are dry, our hope is lost, and we ourselves are cut off. And they'll be so desperate for a savior. And that's when the savior will come. And so it says in that day, says Yahweh, I will open my eyes on the house of Judah. And it's at that point when the Jews in the land are on their knees. They are so desperate for salvation. They are so desperate for God in their life, because their military was not able to save them with the mighty hand of Gog. So it's not until that point of time, at that point of time, that God will open his eyes on the house of Judah. And so we carry on. And so, looking at the basic order of events in the first stage, I guess, of the restoration of Israel, we see that Gog invades the land and 2/3 of the Jews in the land are killed. We saw that last week. Today, we're going to look at how Christ and the saints will stand on the Mount of Olives when there'll be a major earthquake. And then Gog is defeated and Gog's army and equipment is buried. We're going to look at that today. So in Ezekiel 38 in Joel 3 verse 12, it says, let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of Yahweh is coming, and for it is at hand, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness. And this is, it makes us think of Ezekiel 38, where we read that about Gog is going to come, he's going to ascend, coming like a storm, covering the land like a cloud, you and all your troops and many peoples with you. He says, you will come up against my people Israel like a cloud to cover the land. Well, what's going to happen is that cloud is going to be met with another cloud, and that's the cloud of witnesses. That's the clouds that when Jesus says, I am coming with clouds. And that's when the Lord Jesus Christ marches into Jerusalem with the resurrected immortal saints. It'll be a great storm when that happens. And so we sort of briefly looked at this phrase, in that day. In Revelation 14, Revelation 16, we talked about the Armageddon is that great day, the battle of that great day of God Almighty. And we see this phrase, in that day, in the Old Testament a fair bit. We also see it in the New Testament in some places as well. But perhaps no more is it concentrated than it is in these last chapters of Zechariah. Just glance with me at Zechariah 12. And just have a glance at Zechariah 12, chapter 13 and 14. And you will see that phrase "in that day" appear a lot. Okay, so or the day of Yahweh, it appears a lot. And I think I counted 18 references of the day of Yahweh mentioned in those last 3 chapters. Right. And in these last 3 chapters, there's a few words, there's some really, really strong themes that come out. So, for example, the word Jerusalem is mentioned 22 times in those last 3 chapters of Zechariah. And the words nations are also mentioned. And there's one word that's mentioned a lot. It's the word that appears, I guess, the most. It's the word Yahweh. It appears 27 times in those last 3 chapters. And this emphasizes that God will be glorified, Jerusalem is going to be exalted, and the nations will eventually be joined to God. You know, and no wonder it is called the day of Yahweh. Now, in that final vision of Zechariah, you can read Zechariah 12 to 14 and paint a really good picture of what's going to happen. Now, I've got a list of things. It's a huge list, so I'm not expecting you to remember it or write it down or anything like that. But there's a huge list of what happens in Armageddon, right? So, for example, Zechariah 14 verse 2 says, all the nations are gathered to battle against Jerusalem. We read that Jerusalem is invaded by this enemy. Jerusalem becomes this major issue for the nations, this burdensome stone. Half the Jews of the city of Jerusalem are taken captive. 2/3 of the Jews in the land are killed. And it says in that day, God will open his eyes on Judah. God will defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem. There'll be a great earthquake that splits the Mount of Olives. Jerusalem is literally elevated. And Judah fights in Jerusalem, and God destroys the nations that attack Jerusalem. That's a fair few dot points that we can put together of what happens in that day in the Battle of Armageddon. But it actually does, the term or the time period that's defined as in that day or the day of Yahweh is not just limited to the Battle of Armageddon, because there's more. And so after Armageddon, in that day, it says the Jews will recognize Jesus as the Messiah. And then there'll be this great mourning in Jerusalem. Like the people of the land and everyone just repents for what their fathers had done to the Messiah. Judah is forgiven and made clean. And we read that in that day, living waters will flow from Jerusalem. And then we also learn that Judah is going to gather the wealth of all the surrounding nations. Okay. But wait, there's more, because it doesn't stop there either. It's and then ultimately Zechariah 14 verse 9, it says that Yahweh will be king over all the earth. And then all the nations will come to worship the king. And finally, the temple itself that will be built will become holy. And so you think, well, what's the purpose of all this? What's the purpose of Armageddon and all this? Well, it's to execute judgment on the nations. But the other huge reason is to bring Judah, the nation of Judah, or the house of Judah rather, back to God. And so this is a good news story, because God will save Judah. And here we have some verses here. Like it says, then Yahweh will go forth and fight against those nations. In Joel 3, it says that Yahweh will roar from Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem. Zechariah 12 says, in that day I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem. And then Jeremiah 30 verse 7, it says, it is the time of Jacob's trouble, but he shall be saved out of it. And so we have a good news story for the remnant of the Jews living in the land. And finally, in that day, Yahweh will defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Now, I've got a verse here in Joel chapter 2. Now, quite often in our seminars, we read from Joel 3, and even last week we looked at a part of Joel 3, but this verse is in Joel chapter 2. And it's an interesting verse because I believe it's referring to the latter days. And it says, "But I will remove far from you," okay, he's talking to Judah, "I will remove far from you the northern army. I will drive him away into a barren and desolate land, with his face toward the eastern sea and his back toward the western sea. His stench will come up and his foul odor will rise because he has done monstrous things." Now, I want you to remember that phrase, all right? I want to just tuck that into your mind. So this is talk. The northern army clearly here is the Gogian host, all right? It's the army that comes from the far north to invade Israel. And when it says, "I will drive him away," well, that's Gog. That's the army of Russia and its allies. But look where God's going to drive him, into a barren and desolate land. Now, look at the direction they'll be heading. They'll be heading with their face toward the eastern sea and the back toward the western sea. All right, so Gog is somehow going to be pushed in an easterly direction. You got that? Can you just tuck that in your minds? Because we're going to come to that a little bit later. Okay. And another verse in Joel chapter 2, which I believe also relates to the latter days, it says, "The earth quakes before them, the heavens tremble, the sun and moon grow dark, and the stars diminish their brightness." Look what it says. "Yahweh gives voice before his army, for his camp is very great." And I believe that's talking about Jesus and the saints marching towards Jerusalem as the earth quakes when they stand upon the Mount of Olives. All right. And so just picture this camp, this great camp of Yahweh. And this is, I like this picture. It's a painting, it's a little bit fanciful. But I just picture Christ and the saints coming to rescue with an army of immortal saints, coming to rescue the 1/3 of the people who survive the Battle of Armageddon, the 1/3 of the Jews. They will come and stand on the Mount of Olives. And God will defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Now, let's turn to Ezekiel now. If you can come to Ezekiel chapter 39. Ezekiel 39, and we'll read. I'm going to ask Dan to be the accredited reader here. And if you could please read verses 3. Oh, actually, you can just read those verses on the screen if you don't mind. They're on the screen as well.
"Then I will knock the bow out of your left hand and cause the arrows to fall out of your right hand. You shall fall upon the mountains of Israel, you and all your troops and the peoples who are with you. I will give you to birds of prey of every sort and to the beasts of the field to be devoured. You shall fall on the open field, for I have spoken, says the Lord God."
Thanks. Yeah. So who's, where it says, "I'll knock the bow out of your left hand," who's God talking to? Who's God talking to when he says, "You shall fall upon the mountains of Israel"? Well, verse 1 gives us the answer. It's Gog, is the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. Right? This is a carry on. This is a carry on from Ezekiel chapter 38, or it's just zooming a little bit more into Ezekiel 38. So God is going to destroy the armies of Gog, and so we have here in Ezekiel 39 also a bit of a procedure where the Jews have got to bury the dead armies. And so, Dan, I'm going to ask you to read this from your Bible this time. If we could all read Ezekiel 39 and verses 11 to 16.
And it shall come to pass in that day that I will give unto Gog a place there of graves in Israel, the valley of the passengers on the east of the sea, and it shall stop the noses of the passengers, and there shall they bury Gog and all his multitude, and they shall call it the valley of Hamon-Gog. And 7 months shall the house of Israel be burying of them, that they may cleanse the land. Yea, and all the people of the land shall bury them, and it shall be to them a renown, the day that I have glorified, saith the Lord God. And they shall sever out men of continual employment, passing through the land, to bury with the passengers those that remain upon the face of the earth, to cleanse it. After the end of 7 months shall they search. And the passengers that pass through the land, when any seeth a man's bone, then shall he set up a sign by it, till the buriers have buried it in the valley of Hamon-Gog. And also the name of the city shall be Hamona. Thus they shall cleanse the land.
Thanks, Dan. So let's bring out some dot points of what's going to happen here to the armies of Russia and its allies. Well, firstly, God will give Gog a burial place in the land. It's going to be buried there. It will be a very conspicuous place. What do I mean by conspicuous? Very obvious. It's going to be in your face. All right, you can't miss it. It will be called the Valley of Hamon-Gog. The Jews in the land there will bury the dead soldiers. It's going to take 7 months to do the job. That's how many dead bodies there will be. All right, 7 months, a long time, isn't it? There'll be search parties who'll be employed just to scout around for any stray dead bodies. It wants every bone to be marked, and that bone then is going to be buried. So every bone will be sighted, marked, buried. All right, and so and you also you think about it too. Like, remember we read in that Joel passage about this great stench in the land? Well, there will be a great stench in the land according to Ezekiel 39, isn't it? Isn't that what it says, that it'll be sort of on the nose type thing? It's going to because there'll be, it says, where was it?
Verse 11.
Verse 11. What does it say there, Dan?
It shall stop the noses of the passengers.
Yeah. So it's going to be it's really going to be obvious. There's going to be something going on in the land. So it's not going to be done in a corner. It's going to be made obvious to the people who come and visit. And not only this would be like well and truly into the kingdom. People will come and when they come to worship the king, they will see what happens to a nation who fights against God's people. So every bone will be sighted, marked, and buried. Isn't it interesting? Because Ezekiel in chapter 37, he talks about the bones of Israel and Judah coming together, bone to bone. But here we have a contrast in it, because the bones of Gog's armies are scattered throughout all the land. Isn't it an interesting contrast there? So let's now turn back to Zechariah. Turn back to Zechariah 14. So hope you'll be able to find that again. All right, second last book of the Old Testament, Zechariah 14. Yeah, in verse 4. Do you mind reading that, please?
Sure. And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west, and there shall be a very great valley, and half of the mountain shall remove toward the north, and half of it toward the south.
All right, thanks, Dan. So here we have a fact, all right? The fact is that the Mount of Olives is going to be split, and the mountain's going to separate. All right, it says half the mountain will move toward the north, half the mountain will move toward the south. So what could be the consequences of the Mount of Olives splitting in two? That's what I want to explore now. So in other verses which seem to speak about the latter days, in Isaiah 2, it says, "For the day of Yahweh of hosts shall come upon everything proud and lofty, upon everything lifted up, and it shall be brought low when he arises to shake the earth mightily." Now, when you read a passage like that in prophecy, it could be talking literally, or it could be talking metaphorically, right? So that when he comes to shake the earth, it could be like shaking the order of things. The way the earth runs now is operated by political governments and so forth, is going to be turned upside down. So it certainly has a metaphoric application, if you like. But also, we learn in other parts of the Bible that there will be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. I mean, that's what Ezekiel 38 says. It says there will be a great earthquake in the land of Israel. But will the earthquake be just limited to Israel? So when you look at the land there, there's a fault line that runs right through from north to south. It runs through, I don't know if you can see, it's not very clear, but Jerusalem's just there. And the fault line runs just to the east of Jerusalem in a pattern north-south. It runs down the Arabah, right, through the depression here, and out into this part of this leg of the Red Sea. It's also very interesting that there's a fault line that goes actually through the Mount of Olives itself. So if there's a great shaking in the land of Israel, so much so that splits the Mount of Olives, what could be the ramifications of that? Well, Ezekiel 38 verse 20 says, "The mountains shall be thrown down, the steep places shall fall, and every wall shall fall to the ground." Now, I would take that with the context of in the land of Israel, okay? Because it actually says there's a great shaking in the land of Israel. But will it be limited to just Israel? You see, that fault line that we showed you before is this one here. So if you can see the mouse here just running north-south, goes into the Red Sea and comes in here and becomes the boundary. So the Red Sea here becomes the boundary between the Arabian plate and the African plate. And then sort of on the other side of the Arabian Peninsula, you have the fault line which goes between the Arabian plate and the Indian plate. And to the north, you've got the Turkish plate. It sounds like something you get in a restaurant in Liverpool, but sounds like a lot of nice food. It's making me very hungry. But that's not the plates we're talking about here. We're talking about tectonic plates. So if there is a disturbance to these plates, it could lead to a worldwide earthquake. Now, Ezekiel 38 verse 20 also says, the result of this, it says, "The fish of the sea, the birds of the heavens, the beasts of the field, all creeping things that creep on the earth, and all men who are on the face of the earth shall shake at my presence." Again, it could be talking metaphorically, which I think is definitely true, but I also think it's talking literally as well, because just putting one and one together, a great earthquake that splits the Mount of Olives could send a chain reaction throughout all the world. It just happens that Israel is pretty much in the middle of the earth, in the middle of the world. And a lot of plates connect right there, don't they? We have three major plates connecting at that point. So much so that I believe that the tectonic plates have been divinely arranged so that an earthquake that causes the Mount of Olives to split is likely to spark off this chain reaction that affects other parts of the world. And so it could very well cause global tsunamis and so forth. I guess time will tell what will happen there. So we also read that in Ezekiel 38, it says in verse 22, it says, I will rain down on him, on his troops, and on the many peoples who are with him, flooding rain, great hailstones, fire, and brimstone. So look at those four things: flooding rain, great hailstones, there's fire, and there's brimstone. That's four natural elements that God is going to use. I mean, we've already witnessed what severe flooding can do just locally to our state of New South Wales. What it did to the Windsor area, the Richmond area, and more so what it did to like the Northern Rivers in Lismore. Horrible devastation that it caused. It also mentions great hailstones. We'll talk about that in a moment, but also fire and brimstone. I mean, the same thing happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. So if we get fire and brimstone, that would come as a result of a volcanic eruption. Could there be a volcanic eruption in that part of the world? Could very well be. That's what it would seem to say, and that's what I think has happened is in the time of Sodom and Gomorrah, in the time of Abraham and Lot. And so it says that the Mount of Olives will divide to make this very large valley. All right, it says half the mountain will move toward the north and half the mountain toward the south. So there you can see the Mount of Olives in that picture there, in this aerial photo. The Mount of Olives, this little hill, I guess, that is to the east of Jerusalem. Half of that is going to split. Now, how large will this valley be? Well, Zechariah 14, verse 10, I think tells us, because in Zechariah 14, which you've got open up there, in Zechariah 14, verse 10, it says, all the land shall be turned into a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. And so we put on the map here. So here's a map of modern-day Israel, and there's Jerusalem there. To the north is Geba, and to the south is Rimmon. And the distance between those two places is about 54 kilometers. And so there's going to be this large valley, right? This Great Depression, just like the Jordan Valley is this Great Depression, is an Arabah that's going to be 54 kilometers wide. And in the middle of this, somewhere, will be Mount Zion. And here's an interesting verse in verse 5, Zechariah 14, verse 5. It says in verse 5, it says, then you shall flee through my mountain valley. Now, who's the you? Well, these are the people who are saved in Jerusalem, because it says in verse 2, I'll gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. The city be taken, the houses rifled, the women ravished, half the city go forth in captivity. But the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city. The remnant. So the you here is the remnant of the people who are surviving Armageddon. All right, they're surviving the battle, and they're at their last. They're at the last wits. I don't know the phrase. Sorry, I've just got my terminology mixed up, my slang mixed up. But they're just waiting for God to help them. It says, "Then you shall flee through my mountain valley, for the mountain valley shall reach to Azel. Yes, you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah." Now, firstly, the phrase there, you shall flee, in some versions it says to my mountain valley. The word is not to, it's the word, it should be through. You shall flee through my mountain valley. Now, it mentions an earthquake. It says you're going to flee just like you fled from an earthquake when Uzziah, king of Judah, reigned, right? Way, way, way back in the Old Testament. Now, the only other time that earthquake was mentioned in the Bible was actually in yesterday's reading of Amos 1, verse 1, where it says, "The words of Amos, who was among the sheep breeders of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake." So Amos introduces that first verse. It mentions Amos commencing his prophecy 2 years before this earthquake. It must have been a pretty significant earthquake. So much so that it's mentioned as coming 2 years after Amos started writing. But more so, it was remembered. So Amos, I guess, lived in the time of Uzziah, which is before Hezekiah. And now we have it mentioned in Zechariah, mentioned again. And that's about 200 years later, after the event. So 200 years after the event, Zechariah mentions that earthquake again. It must have been a very, very significant earthquake to still have been sort of in the minds of people, in the history, if you like, in the minds of people 200 years later. I mean, what do you remember that was 200 years ago, right? I mean that, you know, we're almost coming to the First Fleet. I mean, it's a bit longer, but yeah, that was it's a long time, isn't it? 200 years. So it says that the surviving Jews will flee through the mountain valley that would be created by the splitting of the Mount of Olives. Right? That's what it says. Now I'm going to ask you a question. All right. So this is your question for the time. So think about this. The Jews are going to flee through a valley that's been created by the separating of a mountain. What event in the Bible does that remind you of?
Moses?
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? It's right. So the hint I was going to give you was, remember, they are fleeing from an army. All right. Look, and this is only me thinking out aloud here, I see that the Jews passing through the Red Sea, the waters being divided, and they pass through the Red Sea as a bit of a type of what's going to happen here in the Battle of Armageddon. This is how I see it anyway. All right, it's a bit of imagination here, that the mountain splits somehow. So the Jews flee. All right. And because, remember where I said the Mount of Olives is? Where is the Mount of Olives in relation to Jerusalem? It's on the east, right? So the Jews are going to flee in an easterly direction. But where are they going to go to? Right? Well, for that, we have to read Isaiah 16. Let's go there. So Isaiah 16 and verses 1 to 5. So this is going to answer, where are the Jews going to flee to? They're going to head through this mountain valley, but where are they going to flee to?
Send ye the lamb to the ruler of the land from Selah to the wilderness unto the mount of the daughter of Zion. For it shall be that as a wandering bird cast out of the nest, so the daughters of Moab shall be at the fords of Arnon. Take counsel, execute judgment, make thy shadow as the night in the midst of the noonday. Hide the outcast, bewray not him that wandereth. Let mine outcast dwell with thee, Moab. Be thou a covert to them from the face of the spoiler, for the extortioner is at an end. The spoiler ceaseth, the oppressors are consumed out of the land. And in mercy shall the throne be established, and he shall sit upon it in truth in the tabernacle of David, judging and seeking judgment and hasting righteousness.
so here we have a passage that's clearly set in the latter days. Now, when you read Isaiah, you've just got to try and work out, is it talking about Isaiah's time? Is it talking about the Babylonian invasion? Is it talking about AD 70? Or is it talking about the latter days? Ask yourself, is it one of those 3 or 4 things? Try and work it out from the context. Well, in this context, it says, well, in that time, the throne's going to be established and one who's going to sit on it in truth in the tabernacle of David. That's talking about Christ. So ultimately, this is talking about eventually when Christ sits on the throne. But before Christ sits on the throne, a message is sent to Moab. Right? And that's modern day Jordan. Okay. The message is, let my outcasts dwell with you, O Moab. Be a shelter to them from the face of the spoiler. Who's the spoiler? Well, that's Gog. So it would seem to me that that when we read a passage like this, that the Jews will flee through a divided Mount of Olives. Right? They will head to Moab, right? That's a fact. And that is in an easterly direction, if you see it on the screen there. All right? They're fleeing through to a safe haven of Moab. Now, could it be, and again, this is only a suggestion, could this be an echo of the parting of the Red Sea? Could it be that Christ, unbeknown to the Jews, leads the people away from Jerusalem secretly? They flee to Moab, and then Gog's armies are sent after them and are destroyed by the elements that were described before: the flooding rain, the great hailstones, and the fire and brimstone. Just an interesting thought. Now, do you remember I asked you to tuck away that little quote in your mind? Remember what it said about the Northern Army? This is what it said here on the bottom of the screen. It says, I will drive him away with his face toward the Eastern Sea, which is the Dead Sea, and his back towards the Western Sea, the Mediterranean. That is exactly that picture we have in front of you. I hope that makes sense. So we're trying to put 2 and 2 to get together and get 4, and I think we've got it there. I think the Jews will be fleeing. What makes them flee? I guess we don't know. But they flee to this safe haven of Moab with Gog following them. But then somehow, miraculously, Gog is destroyed. Doesn't that remind you of the Exodus from Egypt? So we come to sort of the latter part of my class. How much time have I got? I've got a bit of time. So let's go back to Zechariah 14 again. Sorry to keep coming back there. So Zechariah 14, and I'm going to ask Dan again if you can read verses 6 to 7. Thanks.
And it shall come to pass in that day that the light shall not be clear nor dark, but it shall be one day which shall be known to the Lord, not day nor night, but it shall come to pass that at evening time it shall be light.
All right, thanks. So I guess this here is a rather interesting passage. It's quite, I guess, difficult to make sense of. Because first it says that the lights or the luminaries will diminish, and then it says, but there'll be lights in the evening. So let's divide that. Let's talk about when the lights diminish. Now, perhaps that could be due to the massive earthquake, the volcanic activity that occurs, the ash cloud, the smoke that covers the sun and the moon. It makes it dark, doesn't it? And only recently, or I think it's still happening, is the volcanic eruption there in Iceland. It just the plumes of smoke and ash that just make the place dark. But verse 7 probably has a better translation in the NASB, which I've got on the screen here. It says, "For it will be a unique day which is known to Yahweh, neither day nor night, but it will come about that at evening there will be light. So I'm going to ask you a question. Has there ever been a unique day where there was light at evening time? So this is your second and last question of the night. Has there ever been a unique day where there was light at evening?
Would that be the time when Joshua asked for an extension of time to destroy his enemy?
That is exactly the day that we're referring to. That is exactly right, Sister Roz. So that's the day when Joshua asked God for an extension of time. Let's have a read of it. I think it's interesting. We've got the time to do it. So keep a finger in Zechariah. I should have said this before. Keep a bookmark there. Come back to Joshua chapter 10, verses 7 to 14. And I want you to look at this passage as a type of what will happen in Armageddon. All right? Let's have a look at it. Thanks, Dan.
So Joshua ascended from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him and all the mighty men of valour. And the Lord said unto Joshua, Fear them not, for I have delivered them into thine hand. There shall not a man of them stand before thee. And Joshua therefore came unto them suddenly, and went up from Gilgal all night. And the Lord discomfited them before Israel, and slew them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, and chased them along the way that goeth up to Beth-horon, and smote them to Azekah and unto Makkedah. And it came to pass, as they fled from before Israel, and were going down to Beth-horon, that the Lord cast down great stones from heaven upon them unto Azekah, and they died. They were more which died with hailstones than they whom the children of Israel slew with the sword. Then spake Joshua to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel, and he said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand thou still upon Gibeon, and thou, moon, in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed, until the people had avenged themselves upon their enemies. Is not this written in the book of Jasher? So the sun stood still in the midst of the heaven, and hasted not to go down about a whole day. And there was no day like that, before it or after it, that the Lord hearkened unto the voice of a man, for the Lord fought for Israel.
Right, thanks. So there's a long reading, but look at the parallels here, all right? So we have Joshua, who's the type of Jesus here. You have Adonai-Zedek, who's the Canaanite king in Jerusalem, is like a type of Gog who set his palace in his tents in Jerusalem. You've got these large hailstones that fall upon the enemy. And does that remind you of Ezekiel 38, where it says, I'll rain down on him and on his troops and the many peoples or the many nations that are with him, flooding rain, great hailstones, fire and brimstone. And it says that Joshua, with his mighty men of valor, came down. And that's the word mighty men, that's the word Gibor, all right? It's like a mighty strong men. This is Christ and the saints. It says, Yahweh my God will come and all the saints with him. And then it said in verse 14, and I'm going to read that from, I think it's the New King James Version. It says, and there has been no day like that. It's on the screen. There has been no day like that, before it or after it, that Yahweh heeded the voice of a man, for Yahweh fought for Israel. All right? And in Zechariah 14, we read that Yahweh shall go forth and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle. So clearly there's a strong link here between what happened in Joshua 10 where it was light in the evening, to Zechariah 14, where it was light in the evening. This unique day, all right, it's going to be a unique day, just as it was a unique day when Yahweh listened to the prayer of Joshua. It will happen that Yahweh will listen to the prayer of Jesus Christ and bring about the destruction of the armies that invade Jerusalem. Isn't that amazing? I love that. I love that connection there between Zechariah 14 and Joshua 10. So let's go back to Zechariah, and we're going to finish up. Oh, nearly there. So nearly. Sorry, there's two more passages. So Zechariah 14, verse 12. So we come back to Zechariah 14. All right. So Zechariah 14 and verse 12. Thanks.
And this shall be the plague wherewith the Lord will smite all the people that have fought against Jerusalem. Their flesh shall consume away while they stand upon their feet, and their eyes shall consume away in their holes, and their tongue shall consume away in their mouth.
Right. So it's pretty gross sort of description here, like, and some have some have thought that maybe even this is talking about a nuclear explosion, or is it talking about something else? Well, I don't think it's going to be a nuclear explosion, and I'll give you the reasons why. Because it's described as a plague, for a start. The plague comes from God, and it discriminates, and it only affects the enemy. So I don't know. We don't know exactly what that plague or what that's going to be. Brother Neville Clark suggests that it could be something like the Ebola virus that hit some parts of Africa not that long ago. So if anyone doesn't like gross pictures, just turn away from the screen for a moment. And there's horrible things that happen to people that could describe the horrible things that can happen from this plague, like the Ebola. So I'll move on so you can turn back and look at the screen, Amy. So let's move on, and then we're going to read about Jerusalem being raised up. So Dan, could you read verse 12? Sorry, no, I don't. Let's read verse 10.
All the land shall be turned as a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem, and it shall be lifted up and inhabited in her place from Benjamin's gate unto the place of the first gate, and to the corner gate, and from the tower of Hananeel unto the king's wine presses.
Okay, so it says that Jerusalem will be elevated. Now, so we know from several parts of the Bible, don't we, that's going to be Mount Zion, all right? So there's in Psalm 48, it says this, for example, it says, "Great is Yahweh, and greatly to be praised in the city of our God, in his holy mountain." So Jerusalem is described as a mountain in the future, right? And then it says, "Beautiful in elevation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great king." Clearly speaking about a future time, right? The city of the great king. Because at the moment, if you look at Jerusalem, and if you went to the east, so if you're looking at my cursor here, if you towards the east side of Jerusalem, you go down into the Kidron Valley, and you'll look up at the walls of Jerusalem, and I guess you wouldn't call it a mountain. They call it the mount, but it's not really a mountain, is it? If you go to the south, which is where my cursor is, you'll see it is elevated. It's up on a hill. If you go to the west side of Jerusalem, there's a bit of a slope. But if you go to the north side and look at Jerusalem, there's hardly any elevation at all. And yet, prophecy says, the psalm says, that one day, Jerusalem, when you look at Jerusalem from the north, you're going to think, wow, look at the elevation. Look how high it is. So clearly some major geographical changes have got to take place. And so, when you read verses like Micah chapter 4 and Isaiah 2, where it says, it'll come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of Yahweh's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills. That's speaking literally that there'll be this great mountain that will be established. Now, Dan, can you read Zechariah? Oh, actually, I'll just read it. I'll just read it here. Zechariah 14, verse 8. It says, in that day it shall be that living waters shall flow from Jerusalem, half of them toward the eastern sea, and half of them toward the western sea. In both summer and winter it shall occur. So it talks about, it seems to be like this. And so what I used to think was that there would be two rivers that would flow out of the temple. One would be heading east, and one would be like heading east towards the Dead Sea, and one towards the west heading towards the Mediterranean. And of course, with a mountain, that's usually the case, isn't it? You get sort of water flowing down one side of the range, one water flowing down the other side. Now, that could very well be the case, but the Bible would seem to indicate otherwise, all right? Because there's other scriptures that talk about this. So that's what we just read there about the waters flowing, from toward the eastern sea and the western sea. That's what we just read. So when we look at the map, here's Jerusalem, and there's the eastern sea, which is the Dead Sea, and there's the western sea. So you'd think it's talking about two rivers, wouldn't you? You'd think that. But this is what Joel 3 says in Joel 3, verse 18. It says, a fountain, one fountain, shall flow from the house of Yahweh and water the valley of Shittim, or the valley of the acacias. Now, the valley of Shittim is there. It's just on that northern tip of the Dead Sea. Now, remember, it says living waters are going to flow there, which could indicate that the Dead Sea, which is currently several hundred meters below sea level, is going to be elevated. Okay, elevated to at least sea level or above, perhaps, because of the earthquake that's going to happen in that land. And so there will be. It says this fountain's going to flow from the house of Yahweh. Oops, sorry. Just follow the arrow. That's the house of Yahweh, and water this valley of Shittim. All right, so it's going to head east. But didn't it say it's also going to flow that way as well? But here it says there's only going to be one fountain that flows out of the temple. Let's read. Where else in the Bible do we read about the temple, do you think? What part of the Bible really explains a lot about the temple? Anyone know?
The latter chapters of Ezekiel.
Yeah, Ezekiel. So Ezekiel 47 specifically talks about the water that flows out of the temple. And Dan, this is the last passage I'll get you to read, if you don't mind. Ezekiel 47, verses 8 to 10.
Then said he unto me, these waters issue out toward the east country and go down into the desert and go into the sea, which being brought forth into the sea, the waters shall be healed. And it shall come to pass that every living thing that liveth, which moveth, whithersoever the rivers shall come, shall live. And there shall be a very great multitude of fish, because these waters shall come hither, for they shall be healed, and everything that shall live whither the river cometh. And it shall come to pass that the fishes shall stand upon it from En-gedi even unto En-eglaim. They shall be a place to spread forth nets. Their fish shall be according to their kinds, as the fish of the great sea, exceeding many.
Right. So this tells us a lot, actually. So it says, so when we read in Ezekiel 47, it talks about this this fountain or this water that flows out from the temple and flows beside the temple, and it gets deeper and deeper and deeper, and it heads east. All right. It says this water flows toward the eastern region. Which way is east? Well, that's towards the Dead Sea. All right. So here we go. That's that lines up with Joel 3, right, where it says it's going to water the valley of the Shittim. So it's heading east, and so that's the direction there on the map. But it also mentions a couple of places there. It mentions there's going to be fish. There's going to be people fishing at En Gedi. Now, En Gedi, like that's on the sides of the Dead Sea at the moment. You can't fish anything there, right? If there were fish, they'd be floating dead. Okay, so there's just dead fish. It's dead. There's nothing lives there. So because of the salt content in the water. And it also mentions this other. It says this other fact. It says their fish. There's going to be not only going to be fish there, but they're the same kinds of fish as there are in the Great Sea. Now, where's the Great Sea? Well, that's the Mediterranean Sea. All right, so the Mediterranean Sea. So in the Dead Sea, there's going to be fish, the same type of fish as in the Mediterranean. Now, how's that going to happen? How are fish going to end up there? Well, in Brother Henry Sully's book, which is the Temple of Ezekiel's Prophecy, page 153 to 154, he says for this to happen, he suggests that there must be a water connection between the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. Now, at the moment, there's no water connection between the two, because what happens now is the rain that falls and the snow that falls on these mountains here, like Mount Hermon to the north of Israel, the waters melt, they go down, there's this really lush part of it, is Israel through Caesarea Philippi, comes down into the Sea of Galilee, and then you have the Jordan River, which snakes its way, the serpent-like pattern, all the way down to the Dead Sea. And the Jordan River becomes like this symbol of our life, isn't it? We start off young and vibrant, and we go to the park and kick a soccer ball around, and we're active all day. Like we went for a walk yesterday, saw these kids just playing after school. How do they have so much energy? But then as you get older, you can't kick that soccer ball around anymore because you're getting old and you get sore and you can hardly walk, and then you eventually end up in the Dead Sea. And it's that Jordan River is a parable of our life. But what Brother Sully suggests is that in the kingdom, with the geographical changes, for there to be fish in the Dead Sea that are the same kinds of fish as the Great Sea, he suggests there's a water connection between the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean. And how he suggests that'll happen is that because the Dead Sea will be raised up, the River Jordan will flow in reverse, and there'll be a water connection between the two seas, and fish will simply flow along this river to the Dead Sea. Perhaps even that's how people will travel through in that waterway. All right. So just on the screen, here's a couple of alternatives, I guess, where the way the water might go. Isn't that incredible? That what could happen, the changes that are going to take place in the land there. So it says in everything, and it shall be that every living thing that moves, wherever the rivers go, will live. Isn't that a beautiful thing? Beautiful thing, the water of life. And so we end our class by referring back to a very famous prophecy, Nebuchadnezzar's image, right? We're all familiar with Nebuchadnezzar's image. And remember what happened at the end? the stone which struck the feet of the image, it crushed the image to pieces. The elements, the elements of the image, the metals, the gold, the silver, the bronze, the iron, the clay, were all crushed together. And it says the wind carried them away, and they were sort of no more to be found. But the stone, what happened to the stone? It grew. It didn't suddenly become this great mountain. It grew. It started off small, but it grew and grew and grew and grew, and eventually became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. And just like the stone slowly grows, slowly, from when the feet are crushed here at the Battle of Armageddon, then the stone, Christ's rulership, begins in Jerusalem. Starts off small, you see, and so Brother Thomas, he just summarizes this little phrase. I just love this little phrase, and we end on this slide, right? So it says at this point of time, the house of Judah, already as the little stone kingdom, now will strengthen and enlarge itself under Messiah in the Holy Land. That's a quote from Mystery of the Covenant, page 30. So the little stone, it's just this little stone kingdom is Judah, the Jews in the land. They're about to face up to the Messiah, and there's going to be this great repentance, this fantastic story of Zechariah 12, which we will explore, God willing, if God wills, in our next class, which would be next year. But that's the little stone kingdom starting to grow. And so the little stone kingdom, having gone through the devastation of Armageddon, has now its true beginnings. This is the restoration of the house of Judah. The man, this strange man, having saved the house of Judah, is about to reveal his identity to the Jews. That exciting story will be the subject of our next class, God willing.